Hey guys, tonight we begin with the oldest sky stories ever written in clay. Stories pressed gently into earth by hands that shook not from fear, but from awe. Not from certainty, but from the quiet thrill of not knowing what glowed above. Them, if you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Let me know where you're tuning in from. What time is it where you are? Because tonight, we're not racing toward distant stars or decoding hidden blueprints in pyramids. There will be no conspiracies here, no metallic discs streaking through the heavens, just the wind sighing through old reeds, just the whisper of reeds being turned into styluses, and then into stories. We'll step into ancient courtyards, their dust warmed by sun and chilled again by moonlight. We'll follow priests who stood barefoot on polished stone, whispering toward the sky, not shouting, not pleading, just wondering. We'll run our fingers across old tablets, lines carved not for science, but for silence, for memory, for myth, for those soft moments when humans needed a story to sleep beside, because long before the word alien meant a visitor from another star, it meant unfamiliar, mysterious, something from just over the ridge, just past what we could hold. And it is in that soft unknowing that the Anunnaki were born. They were not invaders, not in these stories. They were makers, judges, keepers of silence and water and stars. And over time, the lines between gods and guests grew blurry, but that's where we'll stay tonight. In the blur, in the stories left behind by those who watched the sky, not with radar, but with reverence. And that brings us to our first chapter. The ground was warm when the sun touched it, even warmer when pressed by kneeling knees, elbows, resting as a reed stylus hovered over a fresh tablet of clay. The air smelled like dust and wet ash. Not unpleasant, just ancient. Somewhere, just beyond the city's baked walls, the cattle groaned in low rhythm. And just beyond that, the sky waited. The men who rode into the earth did not think of themselves as magicians. They weren't prophets. They were record keepers. And memory, they believed, was safest in soil. So they wrote, not with ink, not on scrolls, but with pressure. Gentle taps, measured pokes, lines and wedges like soft codes so quiet you could almost fall asleep just watching them appear. And what did they remember? They remembered stars, not as distant fires, but as neighbors, wandering dots with stories. Jupiter was a god, of course, but also a judge, a symbol, a slow mover across the black. Venus shimmered like gossip, full of promise, full of warnings. The moon, a tired friend, reliable, changeable, always watching. They pressed all this into clay, because clay didn't forget. Paper burns, metal rusts, but clay, once hardened by sun or fire, keeps its secrets. Some tablets were practical, grain rations, temple lists, how many sheep passed through which gate. But others whispered. They whispered of a time before kings, before empires, before laws, when gods still wandered the land, or perhaps the skies, when the heavens weren't just seen, they were listened to. The Anunnaki appear in those older stories, not always by name, sometimes just as the ones who descended, not with lightning, not with war, but with instructions. With presence. They didn't wear suits of metal or speak in coded beeps. They carried water, measured time, built rules into the dirt and said softly, here is how things might work, and the clay remembered. Some say these were the world's first myths. Others say they were the world's first facts. But the tablets don't argue. They just wait. In darkness. In silence. In vaults and ruins and under broken homes, every now and then, someone finds one. Half buried. A little chipped. A little lopsided. But still murmuring something, and when they do, it doesn't scream a headline. It just offers a picture of a world where people saw patterns in the sky and pressed them into the ground, and maybe that's why we look up at night. Not just to wonder what's out there, but to remember that once someone looked up and listened, then bent down and wrote somewhere in the old cities Uruk, Lagash, Nippur. There were courtyards full of drying tablets, rows of them, like loaves of bread on shelves, warm from the sun. A city of words not meant to be read aloud, but felt, and inside them, eclipses and omens, instructions for rituals, maps of Venus' strange pattern, a planet that rises before dawn, disappears, then returns like an old friend with a new face. But there was something else in the clay. Not just knowledge, but care, as if every stylus mark was a kind of quiet affection. Not for power, not for gods, but for time itself, for the idea that if you pressed hard enough, a memory could live forever, even if the priest forgot, even if the temple fell, even if the city turned to wind-blown rubble, the clay might still whisper, "Here is where the stars once told us something," and that brings us to something softer still. The way those memories weren't just about stars or gods, but about people. People trying to survive, to work, to find warmth under that massive sky, because while some pressed symbols into tablets, others carried bricks, others cleaned altars, others just watched the stars in silence, never writing a word, and yet somehow their silence was remembered. Two, trapped in those same tablets, between lines, in the space no stylus touched, because the clay didn't just remember the stars. It remembered the people who looked at them. They rarely came alone. The gods of the old cities were not solitary things, perched high in cold clouds. They moved in clusters, in couples, entangled poetic knots of family, father gods, mother storms, brother rivers, sister moons. Sometimes they loved each other, sometimes they devoured each other, but they were never still. The clay tablets didn't just list their names, they painted their personalities softly, like watercolor seeping through papyrus. One god wept so loudly he created rivers. Another vanished for half the year, turning the world to drought. Their stories weren't always orderly, but neither is real life, and the Sumerians, wise in ways we're still unraveling, didn't ask for perfection from their gods. They asked for familiarity, not statues frozen in holiness, but gods who argued over dinner, gods who needed reassurance, gods who came home late, smelling like dust and thunderdot. In those stories, the Anunnaki were many. Not one shining visitor, but a family with chores and drama and purpose. Some built the skies. Some governed the earth. Some ruled the underworld with a gaze so cold it turned flowers to ash, but even they especially, they had relationships. Soft, strange, echoing things. One might comfort another with water poured into a golden bowl. Another might rage, cursing the air, only to be calmed by a sibling's slow touch. It wasn't romance always. Sometimes it was grief. Sometimes duty. Sometimes just the weight of eternity shared with someone who'd seen the same stars. The stories read like lullabies interrupted by thunder. Gentle lines, then a sudden storm of betrayal. Then quiet again. A reunion in the rain, and the humans who listened or read or whispered these stories at night, they must have felt something familiar in them. Not because they believed every word, but because the emotional shape of it matched the way love felt during famine, the way loss stung in winter, the way even silence could feel shared. Sometimes the gods punished each other. Sometimes they forgave. But they always circled back in twos, or threes, or whole courts of glittering emotion. And no one knows exactly how the Anunnaki were described aloud. We have the tablets, yes, but not the tones. Not the lull of a priest's voice reciting at dusk. Not the pauses that made the stories breathe, but we can guess. We can guess from the structure, the patterns, the way one god's name always leads to another. Like beads on a necklace, like footfalls in sand, one always behind the other, and perhaps that was the comfort. Not in what the gods did, but in the fact they were never alone, because the people who carved their names, they weren't alone either. They lived in households with generations layered like bricks. Grandmothers cooking. At dawn, babies napping in the warmth of goats. Fathers returning from canals, skin cracked from salt and sun. Sisters whispering under shared quilts of coarse-woven reed fiber. They understood that to exist was to be linked by blood, by stories, by the quiet burden of remembering each other. So the gods, too, had to come in pairs. Even the fiercest ones. Even the ones who ruled storms or buried cities in sand, because what good is power if no one watches you wield it? What good is eternity if no one walks with you through it? One god, it said, fell in love with the underworld queen. Another swallowed their own children. Still another wept for 7 days, flooding the world just because their sibling was gone. These aren't stories of logic. They're stories of longing, of entanglement, of the soft rope that binds every heart divine or not to another. You can almost see it, a flickering oil lamp. A mother speaking slowly to her child, telling of gods who were angry but forgave, who fell, who returned, and always, always, who remembered each other's names, because even in a world of magic and stars and holy laws, the thing that lasts is connection, one hand reaching for another. One name whispered beside another, so it doesn't vanish. That's what the people preserved in clay. Not just the gods, but the TIs between them, and somewhere in the quiet of night, as the fire turned to coals and the jackals cried beyond the gates, someone surely rested easier knowing. Even the sky was not alone. They didn't climb to speak, they climbed to listen. The ziggurat rose in tiers, wide at the bottom, narrowing as it ascended, like a stepped invitation to the heavens. But there were no bells at the top, no torches flaring in triumph. Just sky and silence. The priests didn't rush. Their sandals scraped softly against sun-baked stone. Each level brought them closer to something. Not louder, but quieter. The wind thinned. The noises of the city faded. And up there, at the summit, it felt like the world paused to inhale. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Some say these high places were built to honor the gods, to bring offerings closer, to watch the stars more clearly, but maybe, just maybe, they were made so the people could feel smaller. In a good way. Imagine it, climbing up with a bowl of barley or a folded cloth, not knowing if anyone would receive it, but placing it down anyway, and waiting, and listening. The silence above the ziggurat wasn't empty. It was full, full of breath and wind, and that strange tingling feeling of being seen. But by what? You couldn't say. Some stood still for hours, not praying, not speaking, just letting the weight of the earth fall away behind them. The sun passed slowly. Clouds drifted like lost sails, and every now and then a shadow moved across the dust hawk. Heron, god, or thought. It didn't matter. You felt it, The view from above wasn't always majestic. Sometimes the streets below were smeared with garbage. Fires puffed out strange colors. Children chased each other through puddles that reeked of copper and age, but from up high, even the mess seemed sacred. Not because it was clean, but because it was alive. And because life, for all its noise, carries its own rhythm of silence, the ziggurat offered no promises. It didn't fix droughts or an illness, but it gave something subtler a place to stop, to breathe, to lift a thought upward and let it hang, unanswered. Some tablets say the gods descended onto these platforms. Others say they never did. But both versions agree on one thing: the height mattered. Not to reach heaven, but to step outside the clamor of needing something from it. There were birds up there. Always birds. Watching. Circling. Perhaps they knew something the humans did not. Or perhaps they were simply companions, offering motion. To the stillness and the stones they remembered, too. Each block placed by hand, hoisted with sweat, packed with mud and hope. Even in ruin, they hold the weight of intention. Even in silence, they hummed out it wasn't only priests who climbed. Sometimes a servant. Sometimes a girl carrying a chipped vessel of oil. Sometimes no one at all, but the feeling remained, because that was the power of the ziggurat. It created a space where the sacred didn't have to appear, because it was already their dot in the height, in the hush, in the long view that made worries look like small patterns on the earth. There are places like that in every age. A rooftop at night, a hill behind the house, a quiet stairwell where the air feels just a little older. We seek them not to escape, but to remember that not all answers shout. Some simply wait like warm stone, like ancient wind, like silence above the ziggurat, and when you climb back down back to the noise and meals and cracked bowls of the day, you carry a piece of that hush with you. In your breathing, in your posture, in the way you listen to things that don't speak, because silence is not absence. It is memory. It is the shape the gods left behind, and in the soft weight of that stillness, you might finally understand. You're never climbing to meet something new. You are climbing to remember something old. They were not made of light, not in these stories. The Anunnaki did not arrive in fire or metal or through sudden bursts in the clouds. They did not hover or beam or roar. They walked. They watched. They worked, not gods of spectacle, but of soil, of order, of burdens, of dust. You could almost mistake them for stewards. Not creators with lightning at their fingertips, but keepers of routine, inspectors of irrigation canals, recorders of animal births, assigners of roles who would till, who would serve, who would kneel, and for all their grandeur, they gave out chores, tasks whispered into the air, then folded into the rhythm of daily life. One tablet speaks of them crafting humans not for love or fellowship, but to relieve the gods of their labor, as if humanity were made not from longing, but from exhaustion. The divine had grown tired. So they made us from clay and sweat and obligation. And in that quiet transaction, creation became delegation. The people who heard these stories didn't flinch. They knew labor. They knew the weight of lifting, of hauling, of building with hands that cracked in the cold and bled in the heat. So to be told you're made to work wasn't shocking. It was familiar, but beneath that hard truth was something softer. Even in being made for toil, there was purpose. A place in the pattern. A rhythm in the repetition. To bake bricks was not to be forgotten. To harvest grain was to feed the cycle. To clean the altar was to touch what the gods had once touched, and the Anunnaki, for all their strange silence, noticed they were watchers not of hearts, perhaps, but of habits. They knew when a field had been oversown. They marked when a servant returned late. They measured, counted, reordered. They breathed structure into chaos, not with magic, but with memory. You could almost see them walking through the city at dusk. Long robes trailing dust. Eyes unreadable. Not speaking, just nodding slowly, as though everything was exactly where it should be. Or soon would be. They weren't cruel. But they weren't soft. Their laws were etched deep. Their expectations clear. They were not forgiving, but they were fair. In the way seasons are fair, rain falls. Crops rise. And if they don't, someone is to blame. To live under their gaze was to live precisely. No grand gestures. Just the quiet discipline of alignment. The fire lit at the right hour. The grain measured to the correct line. The child named according to the stars. And when it was done well, when the city moved like a smooth wheel, you could almost sense their approval. Not spoken, not sung, just stillness. A day without disruption, a night without wind. They were gods of continuity, of keeping the fires from going out, of reminding humans that even in labor there was legacy. Even in mud, there was meaning, and isn't that a kind of grace? To look at your calloused hands and say this is sacred too. The temples may have been grand. The statues may have glittered. But the gods who mattered most were the ones who watched you sweep the same courtyard every morning. Who noticed when the tools were placed back just right, and in that, watching and that noticing, there was dignity. Because even if you had been made from dust, the gods still knelt down to shape you, still stood near when you rose, still walked the same cracked roads when the sun slipped low and the dogs began to bark. The Anunnaki didn't shout. They didn't interrupt. They remained a presence, a pressure, a kind of holy gravity pulling all things back into order. And maybe, just maybe, they weren't watching to control. Maybe they were watching because they remembered what it was like to work too, to carry, to sweat, to build something that might outlast them. Because even gods, it seems, need structure. Even myths need foundations. Even the heavens rest on dust. The gods were hungry, not in the way beasts are hungry. Not desperate, not wild, but in a slow, expectant way. As if their hunger was part of the pattern, like sunrise, or tides, or the long sigh before sleep. And so, people fed them, not just with prayers, but with bread and beer, and bowls of stewed onions soaked in oil, with cuts of lamb laid gently on warm stone, with incense that curled like steam from a remembered dream. The Anunnaki, those watchers, those deciders, did not live on thunder alone. They needed offerings, not for sustenance, perhaps, but for structure. Because to be fed is to be noticed. And the gods, like all things that shaped the world, needed to be remembered. In temple kitchens, before the sky had even begun to lighten, fires crackled. Grain was ground. Flour was kneaded. Thin cakes were pressed flat and stacked beside honey jars and copper jugs of fermented drink. Everything had a portion. Some for the priests, some for the people, and a shimmering sliver saved for the unseen. The offering wasn't always dramatic. There were no bolts of light, no divine forks appearing from clouds. Just smoke, just scent, just the slow fading of steam as food met fire, and the gods received what they needed. Through the air. It was believed they absorbed the essence. Not the grain itself, but the spirit of it. The warmth, the effort, the intention. And isn't that what we all crave sometimes? To be thought of, to be included, to be cooked for. These offerings weren't just acts of faith. They were acts of tenderness. Someone had to rise early, Someone had to stir the pot, slice the herbs, light the coals. To feed a god was to place them in your domestic life, not as a tyrant looming over the hearth, but as a quiet guest seated near the warmth. There were rituals, yes, lines to recite, steps to follow, but there was also mess. Spilled oil, overbaked flatbread, smoke that stung the eyes instead of rising gently, and still the offering was made, because even gods could understand a burnt corner. Even the Anunnaki, for all their vastness, seemed to forgive a slightly crooked bowl. After all, they were the ones who designed the world's first feast, not of gold or fire, but of rhythm, of giving and receiving, of hunger met with care. In some stories, the gods even needed this food. They relied on it, because without humans, there was no one to cook, no one to bring the meat, no one to pour the beer. The power flowed both ways. Without gods, there was no order. But without humans, the gods would starve. It was a quiet dependency, unspoken, like two people sharing the same room, one baking, one watching the sky. There were days when the food was offered during joy, weddings, harvests, the birth of a child, and days when it came during sorrow, morning bread, quiet bowls placed in silence, smoke rising as if to say, we don't understand, but we are still here, and maybe the gods appreciated that most of all, not the sweetness of the fig cakes, but the presence of someone who didn't stop showing up, who kept the coals burning even in grief, who still laid the meal out even when no answers came back, who trusted that the sky, though silent, was listening, and in that trust was the real offering, because food is not just nourishment. It's memory, it's gesture, it's the pause in labor that says, you matter. To feed someone is to see them, to make space for their hunger, even if it's divine. And so the Anunnaki were fed, morning after morning, by hands that trembled sometimes with fear, but also sometimes with reverence. Not every meal was perfect, not every prayer remembered, but still the smell of roasting barley curled upward, and still the gods stayed, because perhaps above all things, even the ancient ones knew this truth. We eat not only to live, we eat to be loved. They watched the sky like it was a friend who only wrote back in riddles, not with words, but with motion, with glints, with absences, with patterns that looped, paused, and returned. To the Babylonians, the night wasn't empty. It was a vast, whispering scroll. And the stars, ink that moved. They didn't wait for miracles. They studied, carefully, patiently. Generation after generation, men sat on rooftops with oiled tablets and measured the heavens 1 inch at a time, not to predict the future in the way we mean it now, but to understand the rhythm of what already was. If Jupiter drifted into a certain house, the rivers would rise. If Venus disappeared for longer than expected, a king might fall. It wasn't fear. It wasn't worship. It was correspondence. As if the sky, in its distant quiet, was writing letters back, and so, each night, they read them. Not aloud, but with eyes, with breath, with the hush of a priest unrolling a list of star movements like a lullaby with no end. Sometimes it took weeks to notice a change, sometimes years, and still they kept watching, because this was not just astronomy. It was intimacy. The stars blinked slowly over cities that pulsed with noise, marketplaces, donkeys, firewood cracking. But above that chaos, the constellations floated, unbothered, a rhythm untouched, and to those who could hear it, that rhythm felt almost personal. A bright dot rises earlier than usual. Someone stirs in bed. A priest nods and notes it on wax. A boy lights the oil lamp and reads last year's pattern aloud. soft as a bedtime prayer, if you're still settling in. Maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Sometimes the sky told of eclipses. Dark disks slipping over the moon, as if the heavens had blinked. People stood still. Goats quieted. The priests stepped outside barefoot to feel the earth tremble, if only in their hearts. They didn't panic. They prepared because the stars weren't dangerous. They were teachers. And like the best teachers, they asked more than they answered. The Sumerians believed certain gods lived in the stars, not as figures of light, but as forces. A kind of language you couldn't speak, only feel, and so they recorded everything. The dates, the positions, the outcomes, not to prove the sky was real, but to prove they had been paying attention. Even the smallest shift mattered. A star dimming before its time. A planet refusing its usual arc. It was like watching someone you love behave differently. You don't shout. You don't demand. You watch. You wonder. You worry a little, and perhaps that's all the ancients were doing. Worrying about the sky. Loving it in silence. Reading it like a favorite poem that never quite ended the same way twice. The temples kept entire rooms for these records. Walls lined with tablets. Columns of numbers. Symbols only a few could decipher, because it wasn't just data. It was devotion. A chart wasn't a tool. It was an altar. To chart Saturn's strange delay was to kneel. To notice Mercury's bright return was to celebrate. To find a comet was to pause your breath and feel the centuries turn. They weren't looking for aliens. They weren't decoding conspiracies. They were listening because in their world, the sky had spoken first, and all they could do in reply was right. And wait, and maybe that's what belief truly is. Not certainty, not answers, just attention. Quiet, sustained, loving attention, even when nothing speaks back. Even when years pass and the stars seem stubborn, cold, indifferent. Still, they looked up, and in doing so, they felt less alone, because no matter how far away the stars were, they moved, and that movement meant something, even if no one knew quite what. Even if no one ever would. It was enough that the stars moved. It was enough that someone noticed. It was enough that they kept writing it down, night after night, under a sky that never said hello, but never said goodbye either, just moved. Not every message came from clay. Some arrived at night, not written, not spoken, just felt. In the quiet folds of sleep, the sky walked and it didn't knock. It didn't roar. It slipped in through the cracks, soft as breath, bright as memory, strange as truth. The ancient world knew that dreams mattered, not because they were magical, but because they were real in a different way. Real not in light or stone, but in sensation. In the way your body feels warm even in a cold room, because in the dream, the sun was shining, and in that warmth, gods appeared. Or something like them. Sometimes it was the Anunnaki. Sometimes it was a shape that could not be named. Sometimes it was simply presence watching, near, enormous. People dreamed of stairways made of stars, of voices calling from behind waterfalls, of hands that touched their forehead and filled their chest with smoke and peace at once. Not hallucinations, not delusion, but the quiet theater of a mind trying to make sense of the cosmos, because the heart always wants an answer. And the sky, in all its silence, sometimes sends one in sleep. There are tablets old, crumbling, curved like ancient palms that record these dreams. Not as fiction, but as reports. A man dreamed of fire above his house. The grain harvest failed. A woman saw a wolf with 3 eyes. Her brother did not return from war. A priest dreamed of a bowl spilling water. The river rose and swallowed the market road. They wrote them down not to be believed, but to be remembered. Because dreams, they thought, were letters from somewhere the waking world couldn't touch, and if the Anunnaki truly walked among them, it was most often at night. Not with gold, not with commands, but with images, data, and open gate. A singing bird. A child who walked backwards and vanished into light. They didn't fear these visions. Not always. Because what is fear when even your own God is confusing? They accepted mystery. They expected it. Not every dream was prophetic. Some were tender. A lost child returned. A dead mother smiled through a window. A field bloomed again. Just long enough to remember what joy had once smelled like, and when the dream ended, when the world returned with its dust and demands, there was no shame. No panic, just a sense that something had been shared, not proven, not preached, just shared. Some built small shrines to their dreams. Others whispered them into wells. A few carved them onto soft stone symbols only they understood, but most simply held them close, the way one holds a warm bowl in winter, not for show, but for comfort, because even if the sky never spoke aloud, it sometimes murmured when your eyes were closed, and that was enough. Sleep, after all, is the oldest temple, and dreams, the oldest priests. There are records, just fragments that hint at shared dreaming, of entire villages sleeping under the same sky, waking with the same images. A flood, a torch, a name spoken in a tongue no one remembered knowing. Coincidence? Maybe, but in a world where crops depended on the moon, where children were named after stars, where silence itself was sacred, coincidence could be holy too, and maybe that's all the Anunnaki ever offered. Not answers, but echoes, reflections, of the world turned inward, shown gently, between breaths, between heartbeats. So, the next time you dream of something vast, of someone kind, or distant, or ancient, of stairways that lead nowhere and rivers that remember your name, don't ask what it means. Ask what it feels like, because that's where the meaning is. Not in translation, but in the hush. The Anunnaki didn't shout. They visited, softly, briefly, beautifully, and when they left no footprints. Only a feeling, the kind that lingers. Even now, even here. In the dark, the gods lived high, but someone swept the floor for every temple carved in stone. For every altar lit with fragrant oils, there were hands below scrubbing, lifting, folding, waiting. The divine may have looked down from the heights of ziggurats, but the prayers rose from below, from the base, from the ground, from the dirt. This was not shameful. It was expected. Because what is sacredness if no one tends to it? And so, in the half-light of morning, before the chants began, before the offerings steamed, there was sweeping, there was washing. There was silence. A servant might carry the same jar each day. A boy might gather herbs for incense, eyes still, crusted with sleep. An old woman might check the stone basin for dust left by the night wind. They were not named in the records. They weren't draped in gold. They weren't painted onto temple walls, but they were there. And their presence made the divine possible, because without them, the lamps wouldn't be filled. The bread wouldn't rise. The gods would arrive to cold floors and forgotten flame, and perhaps that is the quiet truth beneath every religion. The gods require caretakers, not kings, not prophets, but those who know how to keep a fire lit through wind. There's something deeply human in that. To serve what you may never see, to pour oil for a God who never answers, to polish stone that never softens, and yet They did it. Every day, because in those motions, in that quiet rhythm of service, there was a kind of peace. No one expected applause. No one waited for miracles. Only for the soft satisfaction of a clean corner, a straight line of bricks, a vessel returned. Exactly where it belonged. It was, in a way, a form of prayer. Not spoken, but done. A sweeping prayer. A pouring prayer. A folding prayer, and the gods, whether they knew it or not, rested on those gestures. The Anunnaki may have written laws in the sky, but it was people on the ground who kept the temples alive. Dust clung to their sleeves. Calluses bloomed on their hands. Sometimes their knees cracked when they knelt, but they didn't ask for anything. Not favor, not fortune, just to keep serving, because to tend to something larger than yourself, even if it never says thank. You can make the world feel steadier, and sometimes that steadiness is more powerful than any miracle. Children learned the tasks young, not with fanfare, just by watching. A mother folds the cloth clockwise, so the daughter does the same. A father taps the jar 3 times before pouring, so the son does too. And the gods, they watched perhaps. Or maybe they didn't. Maybe they had moved on or never really arrived. But that didn't stop the care, because care, once practiced, doesn't need an audience. It just continues, quietly, faithfully, even as temples crumble, even as myths shift, even as names fade into wind-swept syllables. The floor still needs sweeping, the divine still rests on something. And often, it is not clouds, it is not light, it is not gold. It is dirt, dirt held in place by the same hands that stir, scrub, stack, kneel. So, if you ever feel small, remember this. Every god you've ever heard of stood on ground someone else had swept, and maybe that's where the real holiness is. Not in what stands tall, but in what holds it up, the dirt beneath the divine. The truth is, the past is hard to fold neatly. We want it to fit corner to corner, pattern to pattern. We want it to match our modern shapes. But history resists, and so, when people looked at the ancient world, its towering temples, its impossible stones, its mythologies stitched with stars, some began to wonder, could humans really have built all this alone? That question, whispered through documentaries and dim-lit forums, became a chorus, a theory, a movement, and eventually, a myth of its own aliens, not as invaders, but as architects, as gods disguised in flight suits, as mentors who arrived long ago quietly, brilliantly, and conveniently, without leaving a forwarding address. It was comforting, in a way, to believe we were helped, that our ancestors weren't alone with dust and stone and aching backs, that someone from beyond, the stars, had knelt beside us and handed us the blueprints. But real stories are rarely that clean. And the truth, like laundry hung in wind, tends to twist, because while it's easy to imagine beams of light and hovering discs, the reality was messier. Someone carved those stones. Someone hauled them. Someone tired, sweating, sunburned, measured the angles with a bit of string, then stopped for water, then folded their tunic, still damp from effort, and went back to work. It wasn't aliens. It was people and cosmic laundry. That's just regular laundry beneath the stars. Still, the idea remains that maybe the gods who rode in chariots of fire were ships. That maybe those winged beings weren't metaphors, but machines. That maybe the Anunnaki weren't imagined. They were remembered, and maybe they were not as aliens, but as ancestors. As stories passed down, echoed through dreams, twisted with time, and told again by firelight, until the line between the sky and the storyteller vanished, because we've always used stars to explain ourselves. A child is born. So we say a new star has risen, a storm tears through the village. So we say the gods are displeased, someone appears, wise and strange, from another land. So we say they fell from the heavens. It's not dishonesty. It's imagination. It's reverence, and sometimes it's just the only way we know how to make meaning out of the hard parts, because it's easier to believe we were taught than to believe we learned, easier to say someone showed us how to farm than to admit. We watched the sky for 100 years and finally noticed when the rains came, easier to believe we were rescued than to admit we endured. There's a quiet kind of heroism in that. And maybe that's what the alien stories miss. They forget the laundry, they forget the ordinary work of civilization. The food scraped from pots, the seeds planted to deep, the fingers cracked from weaving, the backaches, the songs. The boredom aliens are exciting, but they're not tender, and history, if it's anything, is tender. Messy, yes, but full of small kindnesses, shared labor, broken jokes between bricklayers, quiet hope stretched across generations. So when we look at the ziggurats, the stelae, the celestial calendars carved into rock, let's not ask who really built them. Let's ask who kept showing up, who folded their tunic, who picked up the chisel, who whispered to the stars not for instruction but for company, because maybe it wasn't that gods came down. Maybe it was that people looked up and imagined being seen, and that was enough. No ships, no beacons, just dust and dignity, and the stubborn, sacred act of building anyway. Some said the gods never slept, that their eyes stayed open wide, endless, watching, not with warmth, not with malice, but with a gaze so steady it could feel like stone pressing against the soul. To live under those eyes was to move carefully, to light your fires just right, to cut the bread evenly, to step into the street with your shoulders tucked in just so, because even if no one else noticed, the gods did, or so the stories said. They weren't imagined with blinking lids or softened brows. They were painted staring, carved staring, their pupils wide, round, rimmed in color, as if they'd seen everything already and were only waiting for you to act. Temples held statues with eyes like that, polished stone, inlaid with shell or lapis, or black bitumen, eyes that shimmered in torchlight, that made the air feel still even when you knew they were only stone. But what matters isn't what they were made of. What matters is how they made people feel, watched. And strangely, remembered. To be watched is one thing. To be remembered quietly, without approval or scorn, is something else. It can feel like comfort. It can feel like pressure. It can feel like love if the gaze is kind, or fear if the gaze never blinks. And these gods, these Anunnaki, they didn't blink. Their eyes sat above the altars, above the gates, above the walls of clay where children scratched pictures of goats and stars. And no matter what you did, the gaze stayed, not judging exactly, just present, and that presence shaped behavior. Not because it shouted, but because it stayed, because nothing is quite so powerful as a silence that sees. Even the workers felt it. The men lifting bricks, the women washing jugs in the river, the servants hauling dates and fish through the market. They glanced upward, not to the sky, but to the wall, to the eye, to the presence that hovered just at the edge of every doorway in prayer. And sometimes it didn't feel heavy. Sometimes it felt like protection, because when a thing watches over you long enough, you begin to wonder if it might care, or at least that you matter enough to be seen. There is dignity in that, and fear, and the strange, shivering stillness of being known. Some slept easier because of those eyes. Some didn't sleep at all. It's said that priests would walk past the statues at night and nod, as if in greeting, as if to say, "I see you too." And sometimes the firelight would catch the curve of an iris, and in that shimmer, someone might pause, might whisper a secret, might feel, for just a moment, that the god had heard, because we speak differently when we're being watched. We stand straighter, or we crumble, but either way, we become something more, and maybe that was the point. The gods didn't need to speak. They only needed to watch, because watching is a kind of remembering. And remembering, in the ancient world, was sacred. To be forgotten was death. But to be watched even wordlessly was a kind of eternal life. Even now, we make eyes on buildings, on currency, in symbols we don't always understand, not because we believe someone is watching, but because something in us still wants to be known, to be held in someone's gaze, even if that someone never speaks. The Anunnaki never closed their eyes. Because the stories never let them, they remained open, still, wide as the desert sky, still as stone, still watching, and maybe, just maybe, that's why we keep telling their stories, because, in doing so, we look back, and for a moment, we see ourselves seen. They were enormous, not always in height, sometimes in silence, sometimes in story. The giants of old, whatever form they took, stood taller than memory, heavier than myth, and hungrier than anything that walked the earth. The tablets speak of them not as monsters, but as burdens, as echoes of a time when everything felt closer to the sky, too close, and someone, always someone, had to feed them, not with fear, but with bread, with meat, with daily effort that began before the sun rose and ended only when your body gave into sleep. The giants were not necessarily cruel, but they were immense. Their needs filled the day, their shadows covered the fields, and their appetites, whether literal or symbolic, never shrank. It was said the Anunnaki ruled the world, but perhaps it was the giants who consumed it. They weren't just figures in bedtime tales. They were metaphors with stomachs. Sometimes they were kings, sometimes refused it either, and so the stories stretched. Greener fields, taller towers, larger thrones, until the people below began to forget what size felt like. And that's how giants grow. Not with each step, but with each silence, with each back bowed just a little lower, each yes whispered when no might have echoed louder. But in those same stories, there were quiet moments of rebellion, a boy hiding the best fig for himself, a woman who swapped the fine oil for river water, a worker who sang while he labored, turning servitude into rhythm, into art, because feeding a giant doesn't mean you believe in one. It just means you live in the same world. And sometimes, survival looks like kindness, even when it isn't returned. Some said the gods eventually grew tired of the giants, that they sent floods, that they scattered them, that they buried them in silence. But silence doesn't erase footprints, or debts, or the stories whispered at dusk about enormous beings who took too much and gave too little. Still, the meals were made, the vessels filled, the halls swept, because even if the giants faded, the people remained. And the act of care, however misused, left behind something honest: a broom, a fire, a pot balanced just right, the smallest acts in the shadow of the largest things. And maybe that's what lasts. Not the hunger, not the myth, but the hand that held the spoon, the quiet heroism of those who kept the world moving, even when it moved around someone else. So who fed the giants? Everyone and no one, and someone whose name never made it into the tablet, but whose story still lingers in the weight of the bowl, in the echo of the hall, in the way we all sometimes serve something bigger than us without knowing quite why. A tea didn't begin with silence. A tea began with chaos. Salt water and sweet water swirling, darkness pressing against itself, a sky not yet opened, an earth not yet named, and from that tangle, from that warm, humming confusion came the gods, not like answers, more like questions that learned. How to walk, the old tablets speak of it softly, as if they too were afraid to describe what became manageable, because now there were hands. And hands could sort, could measure, could clean, and hearts, even mortal hearts, could hold wonder, which the gods no longer had room for. There's something quietly heartbreaking about that we were made not because the gods adored us, but because they were tired. And yet, look what we did with that. We sang, we planted, we built temples that echoed like open mouths, we offered food to the sky, we loved, we wept, we gave the madness meaning. And maybe that's the true miracle, not that we were made, but that we stayed, that we kept the fire lit even when the wind howled, that we named the stars even when they looked back without blinking. Creation wasn't clean, it wasn't polite, it was wild, it was disorganized. It was a God screaming into a void and another answering with a whisper, and in between those two we arrived carrying our little bundles of fear and joy and bread, not to rule, not to conquer, but to continue. Take the madness and make it rhythmic, a market day, a lullaby, a circle of stones arranged just so. Some say the gods regretted us, others say they pitied us, but maybe in their quieter moments they admired us, because while they were powerful, we were patient, and that patience, that long, slow tending of a world not made for us, that might be the closest thing to creation we've ever done, not making from nothing, but shaping what was already there, dust into shelter, seeds into food, fear into song. There are still days when the madness hums, when the world feels too loud, too wide, too broken, but then you light a candle, you sweep the floor, you kneel, to fix something small, and in that motion, that ordinary, sacred motion, you echo the oldest stories, not the grand ones, the quiet ones of gods who didn't know what they were doing, of stars still unsure where they belonged, of water still remembering how to flow, and of humans you still hear, still creating. They used to be everywhere, their names etched into stone lintels, their symbols carved above doorways, their stories carried on the backs of donkeys and river boats, passed from village to village like songs that no longer needed a singer. They were the gods of cities, not distant figures in the sky, but neighbors, presences, authorities that watched over walls, protected harvests, heard disputes. But now, their cities are gone, not gone in the way a candle goes out, but in the slow way a footprint disappears under years of wind. Yor, Lagash, Eridu, Nipper, places that once rang with music and fire, and the hush of incense trails now buried, now broken, now names that taste like dust when spoken, and with them their gods faded too, not all at once, not in fury, just gently. A temple shuddered because the priests never returned, a statue lowered because the roof collapsed, a name mispronounced, then forgotten. And what happens to a god when no one says their name anymore? Where do they go? Do they vanish? Or do they remain, lingering like the scent of oil on old robes? Some say they moved, shifted into new forms, new languages, new temples farther up the river. Others say they sank into the stones, became memory, became metaphor. A god of war becomes an idea of strength. A goddess of grain becomes the rhythm of planting. A deity of judgment becomes the whisper in your mind when you pause before speaking. But for a long time, they were real. They were rulers. They received offerings and gave omens. They had calendars, feasts, birthdays. They were expected to answer, and sometimes they did, rain when none was expected. A dream that came true. A child born healthy after 5 were not. These were the proofs. These were the comforts, but cities do not last. Streets crack, wells dry, walls crumble, and gods, strangely enough, need roofs, because once the temple falls, the prayers scatter, the stories change, and the faces in the statues look more and more like strangers. One day, a child finds a broken piece of carved stone. She holds it, feels its weight, asks, "Who was this?" And no one knows. Not anymore, but even in that not knowing, there is something sacred, because forgetting is not erasure. It's just change, a soft transformation from presence to echo. And sometimes echoes survive longer than anything else. In the corners of museums, in lullabies with no origin, in gestures repeated without reason, the way a person touches their forehead before sleep, the way a bride steps over the threshold, the way a farmer glances upward before pulling the first root from the earth. These are fragments, reminders, little ways the gods stay, not in thunder, not in stone, but in habits, in instincts. In the warmth of something familiar you can't quite name, and perhaps that is their final temple. Not made of mud bricks, not lined with cedar, but made of us, of the way we carry the past, not in grand monuments, but in quiet moments, a bowl passed hand to hand, a prayer said without knowing it's a prayer, a name almost remembered. The gods may have lost their cities, but maybe they never lost their people. They dressed like thunder. The gods of the old world didn't just arrive, they appeared. In feathers, in gold, in robes so long they dragged across stone floors, gathering dust like memories, but they didn't dress to impress. They dressed to mean something. Every feather said, "I fly between realms." Every braid, "I have seen centuries pass." Every ring, every beard curl, every patterned hem was a sentence in a language of reverence, because before there were words, there were clothes. And in the ancient world, what you wore was a form of power. The Anunnaki weren't imagined in bare simplicity. They were swathed, layered, heavy with symbols. Their beards were not just facial hair. They were architecture, carved, curled, deliberate. Each twist an echo of status, each line a map of order. And feathers, oh, the feathers, wings that stretched across shoulders, crowns edged with down, fans that rustled in rhythm with their silence, not because the gods could fly, but because people hoped they could. Because flight was the one thing the mud-soaked earth couldn't offer. To fly was to escape the weight of grain, of labor, of grief. So the gods wore feathers, to remind everyone below, you are grounded. But I am not, and yet there was silence. 2, the more elaborate the outfit, the less the gods needed to speak. A god draped in fur, gold, lapis, linen, and air doesn't shout, doesn't plead, just is, a presence like a mountain, like a dusk that doesn't end, like the moment right before someone speaks. That silence was powerful. It meant, I don't need to explain. It meant, you already know, and the people did know. They had seen enough rulers in dyed wool, enough priests in layered robes, to recognize what silence paired with splendor could do. It humbled. It quieted. It made a room feel like a temple, and maybe that's what the clothes were for. Not for the gods, but for the people, because when a figure wears 10 layers of meaning, you can't help but pause. You can't help but feel small in the best way. like a child standing before a tree that's older than history. In temple carvings, the gods are still dressed. Even now, after the walls have cracked, after the color has faded, after the names have blurred, the feathers remain. The beards curl on. The garments hang weightless over time, and we wonder, how long did it take to dress a god? How many hands adjusted the belt, laid the folds, combed the beard with gold-tipped tools? Was it an act of worship or of duty? Did they speak as they did it, or was it done in silence? Because dressing the divine was no small thing. It meant you touched something sacred. It meant you stood close to awe and helped it appear, and maybe we still do that. Maybe every time we dress for a ceremony, for a funeral, for a festival, we echo that same reverence, not to shine, but to say, I recognize the weight of this moment. I am not casual in the face of meaning. Feathers, beards, silence, symbols of a world that needed to show its faith, not just speak it, because sometimes what we wear becomes what we believe, and belief, when wrapped in beauty, becomes unforgettable. It didn't start with fear. It started with loneliness somewhere in the wide, electric quiet of the 20th century, when the stars felt both closer and colder. We looked up again and asked a different question, not, are we alone? But what if we weren't? And suddenly, the idea of aliens not as invaders, not as monsters, but as visitors became strangely warm. They didn't arrive with claws or beams. They arrived in stories, in whispers, in the quiet longing of people who wanted the universe to mean something more, because meaning is comfort. And comfort is something you seek when the world feels too large or too empty. So we turn to the sky. Not with telescopes, but with hope. We imagine ancient gods as travelers, not of spirit, but of space. We reread the old myths and saw, not magic, but technology. What if the Anunnaki weren't gods at all? What if they were explorers, scientists, builders from beyond the stars who came to help, or to watch, or simply to see what we would do? It was a soft rewrite, a bedtime edit of history. And it made things feel easier, because if the gods were aliens, then they weren't unknowable. They were just different. Different bodies, different languages, different tools, but still curious, still interested, still nearby and theirs. Something gently thrilling in that. To believe someone might be watching, not to harm, but to understand, like a child watching ants build their hills, not to step on them, just to marvel. Reshaped loneliness into possibility. You weren't forgotten. You were observed. You were part of something enormous, even if you never saw the edges of it. And in that story, the gods didn't demand worship. They didn't hurl fire or punishment. They just left clues. A stone too heavy, a carving too precise, a myth that looked like memory, and people followed those clues, not with fear, but with fascination. The alien became a new kind of comfort, a reminder that we are not the first, not the wisest, not the only, that someone, somewhere, might have already figured things out, and might be waiting to share, but only when we're ready. That was the unspoken rule. The ancient aliens, like the Anunnaki, were patient. They gave us pyramids, and then disappeared. They gave us knowledge and watched as we forgot, then remembered, then asked again. It became a modern myth, but not a loud one, not a screaming headline, a sleepy one you tell yourself at night when the news is too sharp and the world feels too fast, and you just want to believe that someone out there is rooting for us, not gods, not saviors, just witnesses, watching as we grow, as we fall, as we rise again, because the truth is, we are still looking for the same thing we always were: connection. Recognition. A sign that we are part of a larger story, and whether it's carved into a ziggurat or encoded in starlight or hidden in a tale about beings from beyond that desire remains to be noticed, to be remembered, to be loved even by someone we'll never meet, and maybe that's the comfort we really need. Not proof, not facts, just a soft maybe, a quiet what if, a warm echo in the dark, and in that silence, something like peace. They weren't just buildings, they breathed. Temples in the ancient world were not static things. They shifted in the light. They hummed with footsteps. They exhaled incense and heat and whispers, and if you stood still long enough, if you listened, you could feel them inhale through the cracks in their stone and exhale through the silence of their rooms. They were alive, not with magic, but with memory, because everything that passed through a temple stayed. The sandals, the smoke, the prayers murmured under breath, the tears that fell and were quickly wiped away. It wasn't about the architecture. Not really. It was about presence. A temple didn't need to be grand. It needed to hold something. A moment. A fear. A gratitude too big to say at home. The Anunnaki had their temples, layered like wedding cakes, ringed with pillars set in stone. That held warmth long after the sun had gone. Inside, there was rarely noise. Just the shuffle of robes, the scrape of bowls being placed, the sigh of someone sitting on cool steps, not to ask for anything, just to rest where the gods had once stood and the walls remembered. Not in words, but in feeling. If a child had cried there, if a priest had sung, if a woman had paced back and forth, waiting for a sign, the temple held it, like breath caught in a room, like warmth that lingers on fabric even after someone has gone. Some said the temples watched. Others said they listened. But most people knew they just were. They didn't need to act. They only needed to remain, because permanence is a kind of prayer too. To still be standing, to still be quiet, to still wait, not for answers, but for company. There are stories of people who visited temples not to offer, but to remember. Not just their gods, but themselves. They'd walk the same steps their mothers had. They'd press their fingers into the same grooves in the stone. They'd light the same wick at the same altar, and watch the flame do what flames always do. Flicker, shiver, glow. It was never about spectacle. It was about rhythm, about repetition. The temple wasn't holy because of what it contained. It was holy because people returned again and again, through floods, through famine, through forgetting. They returned, and in doing so, they gave the building its breath, because without people, a temple is just stone, but with people, with quiet presence and soft footprints and hearts that ache and hope, it becomes something more. It becomes a memory engine, a stillness machine, a place where the past and the present touch gently, and neither one pulls away. Even now, ruins remain. There, ceilings gone, their floors cracked, but still somehow, waiting, not demanding, not broken, just open. The wind moves differently through temple ruins, not louder, just slower, as if it too remembers where it is. Birds land on the ledges. Grass grows between the bricks, and if you sit there quietly, you might hear the breath. Again, not from lungs, but from time, a breath taken by the stones, by the air, by the long memory of worship. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't need to, it's just presence, and maybe that's what temples were always meant to be. Not fortresses, not theaters, but lungs. Breathing for those who forgot how. Breathing in pain and breathing out peace. Breathing in confusion and breathing out quiet, still, steady, sacred, temples that breathed, he wasn't holding lightning. He was holding a shovel, not a golden scepter, not a sword, just a tool worn smooth, its wooden handle darkened by sweat and time, and with it, the god dug. This wasn't a punishment. It wasn't symbolic. It was work, real work. Bending your back, wiping your brow, feeling the heat of the sun not as blessing, but as burden. One of the Anunnaki, it said, carved canals through the earth. Not with magic, not with wind, but with effort, because even the divine, in the oldest stories, had to labor sometimes. It wasn't glamorous. There were no choirs, just mud, just dust, just the heavy rhythm of purpose, and in that rhythm dignity. You can picture it, can't you? A god stepping down from the temple, removing his ornaments, rolling up his sleeves, then stepping barefoot into the ditch. He doesn't speak. He doesn't glow. He just lifts, scoops, presses, lifts again. A child watches from the edge, eyes wide, not with fear, but with recognition, because the work isn't divine. It's familiar, the same way her mother hauls clay, the same way her father carries water, the same way her brother returns each day with dirt under every fingernail. And maybe that's the lesson, that divinity wasn't distance. It was nearness, not in the sky, but in the field beside yours, a god who worked, not endlessly, but once, and that once was enough. To say, this matters. This is sacred too. The ditch becomes more than a channel. It becomes memory. A place where sweat became prayer, where labor became love. Later, someone will build a shrine there. Not large, just a smooth stone. A carved symbol. To remind the world that something holy passed through and left calluses behind, because sometimes the most powerful thing a god can do is get tired. To ache, to pause mid-swing and look up at the sun like any man would, to leave footprints, not of fire, but of mud. And maybe that's why people kept telling this story. Not because they needed proof, but because they needed permission. To believe that effort was enough, that you didn't have to glow to be good, that shovels could be sacred, and that the gods understood, not from above, but from alongside, because a god who's carried something heavy knows how to watch you do the same, and when you fall, that God doesn't punish. He offers a hand. Rough, dirty, steady. There are no miracles in this story. Just a furrow, straight and deep. Water running through it clean and cold, the kind of miracle that comes from repetition, from movement, from choosing not to walk away. And maybe that's the divine we forget to name, not the thunderer, not the judge, but the god with a shovel. The god who showed up, who got his feet wet, who knelt, and in kneeling reminded us, creation isn't just spark, it's follow through, it's tired arms, it's dirt in your sandals, it's showing up anyway. Some stories stretch. They begin as shadows and end as galaxies. They start in a field of wheat and somehow land in the stars. And that's what happened here, because somewhere along the way between the carved tablets and the late-night documentaries, the gods of old became something new, visitors. From the sky, from beyond, but maybe they were never meant to land. Maybe they weren't meant to arrive at all. Maybe they were always metaphors, sky-born metaphors, built not of flesh or metal, but of longing, because what else is the sky if not the biggest blank page we've ever had? We've been writing into it for thousands of years, with prayers, with myths, with lights we can't explain and feelings we can't name. And when we needed order, we drew constellations. When we needed comfort, we told stories of guardians. Above, when we needed wonder, we imagined that someone, somewhere, was watching, not because we were afraid, but because we were alone, and in that loneliness, we created gods, not to dominate, but to see us, and when those gods stopped answering, when the temples fell and the prayers went quiet, we didn't stop looking up. We just changed the words. The Anunnaki became astronauts. Their golden headdresses became helmets. Their sky chariots became ships. Their messages became star maps, but the feeling stayed the same, that we are part of something bigger, that we are not forgotten, that the stars still matter, even if they don't speak. So were the ancient gods aliens? Maybe. Maybe not. But maybe that's not the right question. Maybe the better question is, why did we need them to be? Because the alien explanation is strangely gentle. It means we weren't foolish. We were helped. It means we didn't struggle alone in mud and dust. We were guided. It gives our past a softness, a touch of kindness, but it also does something else. It turns wonder into geometry. It trades myth for machinery. It replaces metaphor with math, and in doing so, it risks losing the heart of the story, because gods, whether real or not, were never meant to be proven. They were meant to be felt. In the pause before a storm, in the weight of silence after a child is born, in the way the stars seem to rearrange themselves when your heart breaks, and those feelings, they don't need ships. They don't need origins, they just are, and perhaps that's the point. The gods were never visitors. They were reflections of what we feared, of what we loved, of what we hoped the sky would say back if it ever replied. They were metaphors that moved, carved not into stone, but into us. So, whether the Anunnaki were astronauts, or angels, or dreams, they've already done their job. They made us look up. They made us wonder, and maybe that's enough, because in the end, it doesn't matter if someone came down. What matters is that we keep looking up, softly, curiously. Together, the temple was quiet, not in the way that comes after a song, but in the way that comes after a farewell. Dust gathered where incense once rose. The altar once warm with offerings, now cool to the touch. No footsteps echoed through the halls. No bowls were filled. No names were spoken, except maybe one. Once a priest remained, old perhaps, or simply tired, draped not in ceremonial robes, but in a linen wrap that had seen many seasons. He moved slowly, not because he was weak, but because reverence has its own rhythm. He wasn't waiting for an answer. He knew the gods had gone quiet, the city had changed, the people had left, the canals dried, the festivals stopped, and yet he stayed, not because he believed the gods would return, but because the silence deserved a witness. He moved through the temple like someone remembering a dream familiar, but faded. His fingers brushed the wall carvings. He swept dust from the corners, not to clean, but to honor, because even absence can be sacred. There was no congregation, no feast day, no chants, just one man, and one offering, a bowl of barley, a sprig of sweet grass, a pinch of salt placed gently where thousands had stood before. And as he set it down, he didn't speak, because what could be said that hadn't already been whispered 1,000 times? Instead, he sat on the temple step, the same way children once had, listening to their mothers hum prayers into the air. He watched the light shift on the stone. He let the silence press against him, not as loneliness, but as memory, because in that moment, he wasn't alone. He was surrounded by echoes, by shadows, by the quiet hum of 1,000 mornings just like this one. when the world still believed, and the gods still listened, or seemed to. The last offering wasn't about belief. It was about completion, about honoring a rhythm one final time. Lighting the flame, not because it would be seen, but because it always had been. That's the strange tenderness of rituals. They don't ask for results. They ask for presence, and he gave it. One last time, he stayed until the sun reached the far wall, until the shadow of the offering bowl stretched long across the floor, until even the dust seemed still. Then he stood, smoothed his robe, and walked slowly to the doorway. He didn't look. The dust settles slowly. It drifts over stones, over broken walls, over footsteps long gone. It covers memories like a soft blanket, not to hide, but to protect. In that quiet, questions rise. Hard questions. The kind that don't have answers, only echoes. Who were they? The gods, the giants, the watchers? Were they flesh or metaphor? Light or shadow? And why do we still ask? Because some questions are less about knowing and more about feeling, about holding space for the unknown. The ancient dust is patient. It waits. It doesn't rush. It lets the wind carry stories away, then brings them back again. We walk through ruins, tracing fingers over chipped carvings, wondering if the stories whispered in stone are still listening. There's a gentle sorrow in that, the sense that time is both healer and thief, that we are connected to those who came before by threads thinner than breath. But there is also hope. In the dust, we find continuity, a reminder that even when cities fall, even when gods fade, people remain, sweeping floors, baking bread, telling stories by firelight, holding on to something fragile and making it last. We live in the shadows of questions, and maybe that's where meaning is found, not in answers, but in the soft dust between them. They held pens made of reeds, but their minds held skies. The scribes were more than record keepers. They were dreamers cloaked in ink and clay, people who looked beyond the lines and saw worlds waiting to be born. By candlelight, they traced stars, wove tales of gods and giants, and sometimes, just sometimes, they whispered secrets no one else dared speak. Their scripts weren't just lists or laws, they were prayers, songs, and sometimes confessions. Confessions of longing, of hope, of the fragile hope that their stories might outlive the silence. They dreamed too much, some said. But perhaps that dreaming was their gift, because in those dreams, the dust became rivers, the clay became voices, and the gods, the Anunnaki, became more than distant legends. They became companions, walking beside the living, sharing in their fears, their joys, their endless, beautiful striving. And when the world was silent, their words spoke, not loudly, but gently, like the slow turning of a page or the soft closing of eyelids at night, because stories are more than stories. They are vessels of memory, anchors for the soul, and bridges across time. The scribes knew this. They carried it carefully, as if holding the last flicker of a dying star, and maybe, in the quiet corners of ancient libraries, their dreams still breathe, waiting for someone to read between the lines and find their own reflection in the night. The sky was not always above. Sometimes it was below, beneath our feet, pressed into the soft, wet earth, molded by hands both mortal and divine, a heaven made of clay. The Anunnaki knew this, not as poetry, but as truth, because before the stars could be mapped, before temples could rise, before prayers could soar, there was earth, sticky, heavy, unforgiving, but full of promise. With every finger's press, every shaping of wet mud, the world was reborn, not in grand gestures, but in small acts. A brick placed, a wall raised, a home built, and in that building, a kind of heaven, not above, but within reach. The gods had hands too. not just to command, but to create .to-shape.to leave marks that would last long after their voices faded. The stories tell of them working side by side with humans, not lords looking down, but partners bending low, mixing clay with straw, laying foundations, sharing sweat, a heaven not distant and cold, but close and warm, and that closeness mattered because it meant divinity wasn't unreachable. It was tangible, something you could hold, something you could feel under your nails. That's why clay mattered, why tablets were made from it, why bricks held stories, because the earth keeps memory. And so do we. Our fingers remember what our mouths forget. The heavens may glitter far above, but the heart of heaven lies in the touch dot, in the quiet, steady shaping of clay, in the soft forming of walls, in the humble acts that build a world. And maybe that's what the Anunnaki taught us after all, not to look up and wonder, but to look down with care. To build, to hold, to create heaven from the very earth beneath our feet. And in that, we find a kind of sacredness that no star can outshine. The night folds around you like a soft, familiar blanket. Outside, the stars scatter their silent light, a quiet chorus humming just beyond reach. You've traveled through dust and stone, through whispered prayers and the steady rhythm of ancient hands, tracing the footsteps of gods who never shouted, but simply were. The Anunnaki, those keepers of order and labor, those watchers with eyes that never closed, those figures clothed in feathers and silence have been with you every step of the way, not as distant rulers, but as companions. Not as thunderous judges, but as the steady pulse beneath the world's breath. They are in the mud beneath your feet, in the stars above your head, and in the space between your heartbeat and your breath. The stories have faded, but their essence remains. A soft echo carried on the wind, a memory pressed like clay into the surface of time. And now, as your eyes grow heavy, as your thoughts drift like leaves on a slow river, remember this. You are part of a vast, unfolding story, one not written only by gods or kings, but by every hand that shaped the earth, by every whisper offered into the dark, by every quiet act of care that keeps the world turning. In that, there is warmth, there is awe, there is soft silence, the same silence that once settled above the ziggurats, that held the breath of countless prayers, that watched without blinking through endless nights. And as you drift into sleep, know that you carry that silence with you, that you become part of the story written not in stone, but in the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. The stars will keep moving slowly, patiently, as they always have, and between them, there is space to dream, a space where gods walk softly, where dust remembers, and where you can rest easy, rest deeply, because in this sleep between stars, you are home.